Welcome to the Santa Fe Distinguished Lecture Series today. I'm Ron Duncan Hart, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to the annual Leonard B. Torben Memorial Lecture. And we are honored today to have with us Professor and Dean Erwin Chemerinsky of the University of California, Berkeley School of Law. He will deliver the lecture today. I would like to say a word about Lynn Torben, after whom this annual lecture is named. Lynn was a leading research scientist and had an inquiring mind with broad intellectual interests. He was born in Montreal, did a PhD at McGill University, and later he was the head of R&D at Exxon before establishing his own nanofiber group. These of us who knew him personally knew what a brilliant person he was. He loved Israel and Jewish philosophers such as Spinoza, with whom we could always have a challenging discussion. Um, and in these programs, we've tried to select subjects that would have been of interest to him. We thank Marcia Torben for being a sustaining donor to the overall series and underwriting these memorial lectures in his honor. She's a founding director of the Santa Fe Jewish Film Festival and has been a supporter of the Santa Fe Distinguished Lecture Series from the beginning. It is my pleasure to introduce Erwin Chemerinsky, the Jesse H. Chupper Distinguished Professor of Law and Dean of the Law School at the University of California, Berkeley. Dean Chemerinsky is the author of 19 books, including leading case books and treatises about constitutional law, criminal procedure, and federal jurisdiction. His most recent book is Worse Than Nothing, which you can see behind me here. It's the dangerous, he discusses the dangerous fallacy of originalism in today's jurisprudence. He is a leading spokesperson about the legal and cultural issues in free speech in our society. He also is the author of more than 200 law review articles, and he writes for the what we might call the popular press through the New York Times, LA Times, and even the Santa Fe New Mexican. We're delighted to see his articles here on occasion. He frequently argues appellate cases at various levels, including before the United States Supreme Court. Dean Chemerinsky is a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He is a former president of the Association of American Law Schools. And for a number of years now, including last year, 1924, the National Jurist magazine has repeatedly named him as the most influential person in legal education in the United States. It is my pleasure to welcome Dean Erwin Chemerinsky as the Leonard B. Torben Memorial Lecturer for this year. Dean Chemerinsky.
Thank you so much for that incredibly kind and generous introduction. I'm deeply honored to have been asked to deliver the Leonard B. Torben Lecture. On April 9th of 2024, an event occurred in my backyard that was videoed, it went viral, it received national media attention. Let me tell you a little bit about the context for this. Ever since I became a dean in 2008, my wife and I have always hosted all of the entering students in our backyard for a welcoming dinner. It's usually over several nights because of the size of the class. We couldn't do this in the fall of 2021 because of COVID. So last March, the presidents of the graduating class came and said, "You didn't do dinners for us. Will you host them before graduation? You can celebrate us in that way." We agreed we would do them over 3 nights, April 9th, 10th, and 11th, and any graduating student could pick to come one of those evenings. The week before this happened, a poster appeared on every bulletin board in the law school, as well as going online. It had a caricature of me holding a bloody knife and fork with blood around my lips, and it said in big letters, Boycott Zionist Chem. The only demand in the poster was that the University of California divest from Israel. As you might guess, the law school at Berkeley has no say or involvement with how the University of California invests. The image of me with a bloody knife and fork and blood around my lips so brought to mind the awful, ancient, anti-Semitic trope of blood libel. Later that week, before the dinners were held, I was told by the presidents of our student government that if we didn't cancel the dinners, that the students responsible for the poster would disrupt them. I said that we're not going to cancel the dinners, that if students want to come and protest, so long as they do so outside the home and peacefully, it's no problem. But of course, if they disrupt them, then they would face disciplinary action. On Tuesday, April 9th, my wife and I greeted all of the students as they arrived to our home. We do so in front. And I was surprised to see that the students responsible for the posters were there. For a moment, it worried me. And then I thought I was being unfair. Isn't it nice that they're being gracious to come celebrate with their classmates? Everyone went to the backyard. There was some time for socializing. And then everyone threw a buffet line and sat down. Just as everyone was seated to eat dinner, the woman who was responsible for the posters, the head of the student group, Law Students Just Palestine, took a microphone out of her backpack, went to the top of the steps in the backyard, and began a strong pro-Palestinian speech. I immediately got up and said, "Stop, not here. There've never been speeches at these events." She continued. My wife went to grab the microphone. Someone videoed it. It went viral, and there were newspaper articles all about it. After that, my wife received, and I received, literally hundreds of death threats. There was an organized letter campaign that generated thousands of letters urging that my wife and I be fired. I have no doubt that the only reason the protest occurred at our house was because I was Jewish. I've not taken public positions with regard to what's going on in the Middle East. My field is United States constitutional law. They weren't asking anything of me. They weren't objecting to anything I had done. This is not an isolated incident from the last year with regard to anti-Semitism at universities. I could spend all of our time this morning just relating incidents, and I'd barely scratch the surface of what's happened. You might have seen many of these in the news. One that I found particularly chilling was at a pro-Palestinian demonstration at George Washington University in Washington, D.C. Somebody held up a sign saying, quote, "the final solution." At Columbia, a student who was being faced with disciplinary actions at the disciplinary hearing said, quote, and I'm quoting, "Zionists don't deserve to live." There was a repeated chant on many campuses when Jewish students were seen, quote, "go back to Poland." There was an encampment at many campuses where Jewish students were obstructed. In fact, a federal judge in Los Angeles found that the encampment at UCLA did obstruct access to campus of Jewish students. I can relate many incidents that were in the news of swastikas being painted on the doors of dormitories rooms occupied by Jewish students. When the semesters and quarters ended at the end of the spring of 2024, things calmed down on campus, and they were much calmer for the course of this past fall semester and quarter than they were last year, but still there were incidents. On October 7th and October 8th, there were celebrations on over 100 campuses of what Hamas had done. I know what happened on the Berkeley campus. There was an anti-Israel demonstration where a sign was held, and I quote, "Israel deserves 10,000 October 7th. There's a large campanile in the middle of the Berkeley campus. Someone hung a banner on it praising Hamas and the resistance. The Anti-Defamation League has documented a significant increase in anti-Semitic incidents over the last year. So that's what I want to talk about this morning. And I want to address three questions. First, why has this occurred? Second, what does the First Amendment say about this? And third, what do we do going forward? In terms of the why, I think it's important that we resist simplistic answers. Part of it, I believe, is that anti-Semitism was always there, and that somehow in recent years we've turned over a rock that makes it more acceptable for people to feel they can express it. What used to be impermissible in polite company about saying things against Jews now has somehow become acceptable if it's phrased being against Zionists. I had an incident at my law school, October 11th of 2023. I do a town hall for students every semester. And by coincidence, it was October 11th, just 4 days after the tragedy in Israel. And it was a very tense meeting. And one student said to me, I don't feel safe in the law school. And I said, I'm sorry, what can we do to make you feel safe? She said, get rid of all the Zionists here. This was in a room with many people. And I'm sure the other Jews in the room, heard this as, get rid of the Jews here. Yet she had no hesitation about expressing it. I've seen the expression of anti-Semitism in other ways as well. As I mentioned in the kind introduction, I often write op-eds. I've been doing so now for 40 years. Something changed over the last several years. Now, often when I write an op-ed, I will get hate mail that refers to my being Jewish. The op-ed can have absolutely nothing to do with religion or the Middle East. Maybe say a Supreme Court decision about guns or a Supreme Court decision about abortions. And the way the hate mail is written uses a slur against Jews and attacks me in that way. I started to see that several years ago, and it certainly increased over the last year. But I don't think it's just that anti-Semitism is always there and it's being expressed. I think that the political left has developed a myth that Israel is an illegitimate country, that it's a settler colonialist state that has no right to exist at all. And many on campuses, students and faculty alike, have come to accept this account of Israel. Their argument is that this area should be entirely a Palestinian state. You might have heard the chant on campuses, from the river to the sea, Palestine should be free. Or the chant, we don't want no two-state, we want 48. These are ways of saying that Israel is illegitimate and shouldn't exist. This is a myth that's been propagated over recent years, but it's certainly come to be embraced by the political left. And it's something that we need to counter. It's something that accounts, I think, for the rise of anti-Semitism. And the risk of being controversial, when we talk about why is this happening, I think we have to say that Israel's policies, too, are in part responsible. To be clear, I strongly favor the existence of Israel as a Jewish state. But I do not believe criticizing Israel's policies is any more unacceptable than criticizing the United States policies are anti-American. I will frequently criticize what the government of the United States is doing. And likewise, I think it's appropriate to criticize Israel. I think it has to find a way of providing rights for all who are there, including Palestinians on the West Bank. I think there are important questions to ask about what Israel has done in Gaza. But all of this, I think, has fueled what we've seen on campuses in recent years. Well, that takes me to the second part of my remarks. What does the First Amendment have to say about this? The core of the First Amendment is that all ideas and views can be expressed, period. Under the First Amendment, never is the government, including a public university, empowered to punish it or to censor it. Even deeply offensive and objectionable ideas and views can be expressed under the First Amendment. Now, I do think it's important to draw a distinction between public universities, where the First Amendment applies, and private universities, where the First Amendment doesn't apply. The Constitution, including the First Amendment, apply only to the government. Private entities, including private universities, don't have to comply with the Constitution. But in reality, most private universities choose to follow free speech principles, even though they don't have to. In California, there's a state statute that says that a private school cannot punish speech, that a public school cannot punish because of the First Amendment. Almost every college university has a faculty and student handbook. These provide assurances of academic freedom, of freedom of speech, and these are deemed by courts to be contracts between the university and its faculty and students. You might remember an incident that occurred in a congressional hearing in early December 2023, where presidents of several private universities, Harvard and MIT and the University of Pennsylvania, were asked whether the expression of support for genocide on campus would be tolerated there. All of these presidents were of private universities. They easily could have said, in our private university, there's no right to express that. But instead, they embraced the First Amendment. Their answer was legally correct, though I think tone deaf to the situation. They said it will all depend on context. They're right in the sense that the idea of genocide, however abhorrent, can't in itself be punished. But there's certainly contexts, and I'll talk about them, where the speech is outside the scope of the First Amendment. Now, it's easy to Monday morning quarterback. It's easy with hindsight to think about what those presidents of the university should have said. I think they should have expressed that under the principles of community, the expression of genocide is unacceptable. That would be immediately condemned by the university. But whether the students had a right to express it is a different question, and a legal one at that. Now, while I'm talking about the right to express one's views on campus, including objectionable ideas, I also want to make clear that freedom of speech is not absolute. We all know that. We've all heard the famous words from the late Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes that there's no right to falsely shout fire in a crowded theater. The Supreme Court has identified that there are some categories of speech that are unprotected by the First Amendment, and they're relevant to what we're talking about now. Incitement of illegal activity is not protected speech. And if anyone engages in incitement, they can be punished. But it's important to distinguish our colloquial use of the word incitement from the legal test for incitement. The legal test is that in order to be incitement and speech unprotected by the First Amendment, there has to be a likelihood of imminent illegal activity, and the speech must be directed at causing imminent illegal activity. Example, imagine there's an angry crowd on campus. Imagine a speaker exhorts that crowd to commit acts of vandalism or arson. The speaker could be punished for doing that. But the expression of an idea, even an idea as horrible as genocide, isn't in itself enough to meet the test for incitement. There has to be a likelihood of imminent illegal activity. The speech has to be directed at causing imminent illegal activity. Another category of speech that's unprotected by the First Amendment is what the Supreme Court has called true threats. The Supreme Court has said it's a true threat if a person acts with reckless disregard that another will perceive it as a threat of violence. There was a Supreme Court case about this just in June 2023, Counterman versus Colorado. It involved a person in Colorado who sent hundreds of messages to a local musician. They became increasingly aggressive over time. He was prosecuted for true threats. And the Supreme Court said, in order to hold him guilty, it would have to be shown that he acted with reckless disregard, that she would perceive it as threatening. Imagine that somebody were to paint a swastika on the door of a dormitory room of a Jewish student, or tack a noose under the door of a dormitory student, of a dormitory room of a black student. I think they're reasonably regarded as a true threat. But as I'll talk about, expressing hate to a group isn't deemed by itself a true threat unprotected by the First Amendment. Another category of speech unprotected by the First Amendment is harassment. There's no First Amendment right to use speech to harass another. Think of it in the workplace context. Imagine an employer says to an employee, sleep with me or you're fired. And when the employee sues the employer says, I was just engaged in speech. The employer, of course, will lose. There are many cases that deal with when speech becomes harassment in the workplace. These cases say that if the speech is directed at a person or sufficiently severe and pervasive to materially interfere with employment opportunities based on race, sex, religion, sexual orientation, that's a hostile environment and it's unprotected by the First Amendment. Likewise, speech on a campus that creates a hostile environment, that's directed at students, or is so pervasive as to materially interfere with educational opportunities, is not protected by the First Amendment. Now, I've listed some of the categories of unprotected speech that are most important for college universities. You'll notice there's a category of speech that I didn't list as unprotected, and that's hate speech. That's because the Supreme Court generally has said that hateful expression is constitutionally safeguarded. When I do talks about the First Amendment, one of those frequent questions I get is, where is the line drawn between free speech and hate speech? And I have to say, that's a false distinction because the Supreme Court generally treats hate speech as protected speech. I'll give you some examples. There was a Supreme Court case in 1992, RAV versus City of St. Paul. St. Paul, Minnesota adopted an ordinance that prohibited burning a cross or painting a swastika in a manner likely to anger, alarm, or cause resentment. Burning a cross, painting a swastika are vile symbols of hate. But the Supreme Court unanimously declared that law unconstitutional. Or a case in 2003, Virginia versus Black. Virginia adopted a law prohibiting cross burning. It did so in light of the tragic history in that state of cross burning being used to intimidate and threaten. But the Supreme Court, in an 8-1 decision, declared the Virginia law unconstitutional. In the early 1990s, over 360 college universities adopted hate speech codes. Everyone to come to court, without exception, was declared unconstitutional. Why is this? Almost every European country has a law that prohibits hate speech. Why doesn't we do the same thing in the United States? I think in part it's because of the difficulty of defining what's hate speech in a manner that's not unduly vague and overbroad. In the United States, any law that regulates speech has to be clear about what's prohibited and what's allowed. It can't regulate substantially more speech than the Constitution allows to be regulated. Think about how would you define hate speech in a way that isn't vague and overbroad. I taught a class on free speech on campus to undergraduates a number of years ago, and I asked them to go through this exercise. Try to write a hate speech code that would meet constitutional scrutiny. They found it very difficult, if not impossible, to do. Many of the hate speech codes that were adopted in the United States copied language from Europe. For example, the University of Michigan hate speech code prohibited speech that, quote, stigmatized or demeaned on the basis of race, sex, religion, sexual orientation. But what does it mean to stigmatize or demean? A lawsuit was brought, Doe versus University of Michigan, arguing that this was unconstitutional. It was brought in part by a sociobiology student who said, my research is about whether or not there are inherent differences between men and women. I'm afraid that my research might be found to stigmatize or demean on the basis of sex. The federal court declared the Michigan hate speech code unconstitutional on vagueness grounds. I think, though, that most of all, the reason hate speech is tolerated in the United States, as horrible as it can be, is what I said earlier. Under the First Amendment, all ideas and views can be expressed. Hate speech is abhorrent, but expressing an idea and a viewpoint. And I see no likelihood that the Supreme Court is going to change the law in this regard. Now, I've covered the categories of unprotected speech that are most relevant to campuses. And to be clear, if hate speech rises to the level of incitement, if hate speech is a true threat directed at somebody, if hate speech becomes harassment, then it's not protected by the First Amendment. It's just that the idea can't be outlawed. One other thing that's important in talking about colleges and universities is there can be time, place, and manner restrictions with regard to speech. Even when there's a right to use government property for speech, it doesn't mean that all government property can be used at any moment in time. And thus, the Supreme Court has said, quite famously, there can be time, place, manner restrictions, so long as they're content neutral, they apply to all views and topics the same, so long as they leave adequate alternative places for communication. Let me give you examples of this with regard to campuses. Many campuses have rules that say there can't be protests or demonstrations near classroom buildings when classes are in session. This makes great sense because it's a time, place, manner restriction that serves the important goal of preventing disruption of education, and it leaves adequate places and time for communication. Another example of this is after the spring of 2024, many universities, including the University of California, adopted prohibitions of encampments on campuses. Again, this is a time, place, manner restriction. It prohibits encampments for any purpose, whatever the message, whatever the topic, and it leaves other ways for people to express themselves. I expect that courts will uphold this as constitutional. And so as we think about what campuses can and can't do, it's crucial to remember that time, place, manner restrictions are allowed, so long as they apply the same to all speech, regardless of its content, and so long as they leave adequate places for communication. Well, I've talked about the First Amendment and how it limits what college universities can do. Let me now move to my third and final part of the remarks. What can we do? What should we do in going forward? I think there's many things that we need to do. I think we need to educate students. We need to educate society more generally. But when we talk about college universities, we're talking about educational institutions. That's what they're there for. And I am constantly stunned at how little my students know about the history of the Middle East or what's led to what's going on now. I had the experience a few months ago where I was talking to a group of students and mentioned to them that it was the anniversary of the Balfour Declaration. Not a single student I was talking to had ever heard of the Balfour Declaration. Of course, the Balfour Declaration played a key role in England recognizing that there should be a Jewish state in the area we now know as Israel. I've been surprised that few of my students know what occurred in 1948. Now, an area was supposed to have both a Jewish state and a Palestinian state, and how that was rejected. And instead, the Arab countries went to war against Israel. They know little of the history of how the War of 1967 occurred. And so I think that part of what we have to do is to educate people. I think a failure of our generation is I don't think we've done a very good job in communicating of why the existence of Israel is so important for the Jewish people. I think one of the reasons you may find a lot of skepticism among college students, even Jewish college students, is they don't know the history that led to Israel or know why Israel is so important. That's our duty. But I think also as educational institutions, we must encourage people to listen to one another. We need to have programs that present the Palestinian perspective, or more precisely, perspectives, an Israeli perspective, or more precisely, perspectives in all other. And we should ask people to listen carefully to the voices of all. Second, in terms of what we need to do, we must resist false dichotomies. I believe that it is possible to support Israel and support Palestinian rights. I do not see any tension between these. Indeed, I've litigated cases in federal court on behalf of Palestinian rights. At the same time, as I've said to you, I am emphatic and unequivocal in my support for Israel as a Jewish state. Or I think it's possible to mourn the loss of life in Israel and the loss of life in Gaza. There's no tension with being compassionate for all. Condemning anti-Semitism doesn't mean that we can't also condemn Islamophobia. Third, I think it's very important that we enforce Title VI with regard to college campuses. Title VI refers to a provision of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. It says that recipients of federal funds cannot discriminate on the basis of race or national origin. The Department of Education has held that this includes religion, especially when we're talking about Jews and Muslims. And there's some Supreme Court support for that interpretation. Title VI, beyond prohibiting discrimination, has also been interpreted to forbid harassment. And this includes prohibiting there being a hostile environment. You might have heard over the last year of a number of Title VI investigations being opened against universities because of the way in which they've handled things since October 7th of 2023. Now, it's important to remember that Title VI doesn't give license to a campus to violate the First Amendment. If speech is protected by the First Amendment, Title VI can't be a basis for punishing that speech. But what Title VI does say is that colleges and universities cannot be deliberately indifferent to speech that creates a hostile environment or constitutes harassment. Catherine Lehman is the Assistant Secretary of Education for Civil Rights. She's head of the Department of the Office of Civil Rights and Education. And she has repeatedly made this point. Even when speech is protected by the First Amendment, it can still create a hostile environment under Title VI. And then college universities have the obligation to respond, even if they can't stop or punish the speech. Let me give an illustration of this, of a case that I was personally involved in. It's a case called Fund for the Feminist Majority versus Hurley. It involves a public university in Virginia, Mary Washington University. There was a campus debate as to whether to allow Greek life. Three women wrote an op-ed in the campus newspaper saying that when there's fraternities on campus, there's more violence against women, and opposed there being Greek life allowed. They then got targeted. It was over a then existing social media platform called Yik Yak. There were 600 awful messages sent to and about them. Some threatened them with rape and murder. They went to the campus, and the campus said, "This is anonymous speech over social media. We can't do anything." Indeed, the campus posted on its campus website that it was not responsible for anonymous speech over social media by its students. The women sued, and they did so under another civil rights statute, Title IX, that says that educational institutions receiving federal funds can't discriminate based on sex. Like Title VI, it prohibits harassment, it prohibits a hostile environment. The federal district court in Virginia, ruled in favor of Mary Washington University. The federal district court said, "This is free speech." I represented the women's students in the United States Court of Appeals for the Fourth Circuit. And the Fourth Circuit reversed the district court and ruled in their favor. The Fourth Circuit said, under the civil rights statute, the university can't be deliberately indifferent. It can't, as here, do nothing. Assistant Secretary of Education Lehman, in a Dear Colleague letter last May, outlined the many things that college universities can do when there's hateful, harassing speech. Campus administrators can condemn it. Where appropriate, as it was at Mary Washington University, they can provide physical protection for the students. They can provide counseling support. They can provide trainings. They can provide educational programs. Now, the courts have not fully defined what campuses need to do to avoid liability under Title VI or under Title IX. But it is clear is they can't do nothing. Fourth, I think that we have the obligation to work for a peaceful and just solution in the Middle East. The reality is that the protests on campuses are going to continue. They will intensify until the situation in the Middle East is resolved. The hostages must finally be returned. At the same time, we, those with influence, must press for a solution that provides for protection of Palestinian rights, as well as at the same time assuring Israel's security. Finally, and maybe most immediately for all of us, we need to provide support for our Jewish students on campuses across the country. Many feel beleaguered. I listed only a handful of examples of what they're experiencing. Many feel unsafe. I have had women students say to me that they don't feel comfortable wearing a Star of David necklace when they walk across campus. I've heard students being assaulted for being perceived as Jewish. This is unacceptable. And so we need to make sure that campus universities provide full protection for Jewish students. And we should reach out and support the Jewish students on campus. How do we do this? On almost every campus, there's a Hillel. On many campuses, there's Chabad. These have been important refuges for Jewish students, especially over the last year. They need our support. Many colleges have Jewish student associations. In my law school, there's a Jewish Law Student Association. These need our support. They need us to provide them financial help. They need us to provide mentoring for students. They need us to provide emotional support for students. I do not foresee the situation getting better in the short term. I think the peace on campus in the fall may have given some a false sense of serenity and security. But I do think that the issues are long-lasting and they have to be confronted. It's not going to get better unless we take action to make it better. Again, thank you so very much for giving the honor of delivering this lecture. And as I was asked, I saved about 20 minutes or so for questions.
We have a number of questions. Stephen Levy says, what is the difference between painting a swastika on a Jewish student's dormitory door and burning a cross on someone's lawn? I think you described the former as prohibited harassment and the latter as merely hate speech. Uh, could you address it?
No, painting a swastika on somebody's door or burning a cross on somebody's lawn, both would be prohibited. Neither is protected by the First Amendment. Let me give the facts of the case that I mentioned. It's a case called Virginia versus Black from 2003. It involved the Virginia law that prohibited cross burning. And it had two matters that came to the Supreme Court together. One involved a Klan rally on a relatively isolated farm. They burned a cross. The other was a cross that was burned on the lawn of a home that was recently purchased by an African American family. The Supreme Court said the government can't prohibit all cross burning, even though it's a vile symbol of hate. The court said the government couldn't prohibit the Klan from burning the cross on the isolated farm. There were almost no onlookers, and so under those circumstances, it couldn't be punished. On the other hand, the men who burned the cross on the lawn of the home could be punished because it was directed at somebody. It was a true threat. So let me give the example. If somebody puts a noose on a door in a dormitory room of a black student, that can be punished. If somebody hangs a noose or what appears to be it over a tree in the middle of the campus, that's not directed at somebody. It's vile, but it can't be punished. But whenever the speech is directed at somebody, somebody's dormitory door, somebody's lawn, that's not protected by the First Amendment.
David Schulman asks a political question, um, which is, do you think the incoming administration will be, how do you think it will handle differently the Title VI enforcement from the previous administration?
I don't know. It'll be interesting to see, and perhaps it's been nominated, I haven't seen, who will be the Assistant Secretary of Education for the Department of Education for Civil Rights. In the prior Trump administration, it was Kenneth Marcus, who's the head of the Brandeis Center, and I think he would then take a very aggressive approach against anti-Semitic speech. I'm not sure who it will be, so I don't know what their position would be. I think that Catherine Lehman, who I mentioned in my talk, has done a really good job, a very nuanced job of saying that even if it's speech protected by the First Amendment, it can still violate Title VI and Title IX. And even if it's speech protected by the First Amendment, if it violates Title VI, Title IX, campuses can't be deliberately indifferent. And she's outlined what kinds of things campuses should be doing so they're not deliberately indifferent. Um, I hope that the Trump administration follows this approach. And this is not political. I think that whether you're liberal or conservative, Republican or Democrat, we should all want the responses that are needed when there's harassment on campus.
Jane Wishner asks, or comment is, what is your view about using the definition of anti-Semitism adopted by the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance on campus? There is controversy over whether codifying the definition in law might be unconstitutional. Can you explain your analysis of that issue?
Yes, let me start by saying I fear we've spent too much time arguing over the definition of anti-Semitism rather than focusing on how do we deal with it when it clearly exists, like in the examples that I mentioned. The definition that you mentioned has been adopted by the federal government. There's much that's laudable, but there's also parts of it that I think could not meet First Amendment scrutiny. For example, one part of it says that it's inappropriate to hold Israel to a double standard and ask it to meet higher standards with regard to morality and human rights than for other countries. as phrased, that's a restriction of speech. And I also substantively disagree. I want the United States to meet the highest standards of morality and human rights. And I, who care deeply about Israel, want it to meet the highest standards of morality and human rights, even though others aren't doing so. Yet, if I criticize Israel on this basis, under that definition, it would be anti-Semitic. So I think much of that definition is right. I think some of it is too broad. I think some of it would violate the First Amendment. Though, as I said, I don't know that it's profitable to spend a lot of time arguing over the definition of anti-Semitism.
Philip Goldstone and Stephen Ross both address the issue of education about anti-Semitism. Um, and the question comes up that in some cases, is it the faculty that need to educate the students in the narrative of Israel as legitimate? How can we address these issues with the students? Um, so basically, the question, and there's another question about how departments might be responsible within schools. Um, so the questions, this group of questions are looking at what can be done in terms of educating students within the college university setting.
I think we have an obligation to do so much more to educate students than's going on now. To educate students about anti-Semitism, to educate students about history with regard to the Middle East. Now, let me give specific suggestions. Most colleges and universities have some kind of training at the beginning, the orientation, or the start of the program, with regard to bias and implicit bias. These need to include discussion of anti-Semitism. Historically, they haven't. When there's been a focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion, it needs to include consideration with regard to anti-Semitism. That I find that my students have, for the most part, very little understanding of the history of anti-Semitism. I was deeply hurt and upset when I saw the poster with me holding a bloody knife and fork and blood around my lips. But I found that many of my students had never heard of blood libel. Interestingly, reports on many campuses in the last year, including Stanford, have talked about the trope of blood libel has been resurfaced. We need to be expressing that. I think we need to do a better job of having programs on the Middle East to educate our students about the history of the Middle East. And there's many perspectives of the history of the Middle East, but again, people have to start by knowing that history. In terms of departments, I have been outspoken about this. I do not believe that schools and departments should be taking positions on issues, including with regard to the Middle East. Certainly, I believe faculty individually, faculty as groups can take positions, but it's not for the department as department or the school as school take a position. I was very upset when I saw ethnic studies departments at the University of California as departments taking strong anti-Israel positions. I actually don't believe they have authority to do that. I think only the regents of the University of California can take positions for the University of California. I also worry about faculty who don't agree with the position of the department, or students in the department who don't agree with it. And so I've urged on my campus that the department is department, the school is a school, not take positions that be left to individual faculty members. They have the First Amendment right to do it. They have academic freedom, but the department, the institution, doesn't have the ability to do this. In this past summer of 2024, the regents of the University of California adopted a policy limiting the ability of schools and departments to take positions, and I agree with that.
Related to this, one of my concerns, I'm an anthropologist, And in professional associations, we also have the situation where professional associations are taking political stands on Israel, um, that stands that seem to include anti-Semitic elements. Um, I don't know. Can you speak to that?
Well, I think it's different than when you're talking about schools or departments from a legal perspective, because I don't believe the school or the department can take a position. As I said, usually it's only the regents, the board of trustees, or those they delegated to do so. And that makes it different from a professional association. But some of my underlying concern is the same. If a professional association takes a strong political position, what does that say to those who have a different view? If a professional association takes a very strong again, anti-Israel position, that Israel is illegitimate and shouldn't exist, then what room is there for the 85% of American Jews who believe that Israel should continue to exist as a Jewish state? So, to the extent that I'm part of a professional association that's considering this, I'd urge them not to take a position so it can be inclusive of all viewpoints and all ideas.
There is a question, an anonymous question, about the difference between anti-Semitism of the left and of the right, and how that it is affecting the university situation. And implicit, I think there is the question about, is the left more of a university phenomenon, and how different is it from the anti-Semitism on the right?
I want to be clear that I don't believe that criticizing Israel and its policies is anti-Semitic, as I said, any more than criticizing United States policies is anti-American. But I also said that I think now what previously would have been condemned as anti-Jewish just gets rephrased as anti-Zionist and becomes politically acceptable to express. And often that is blatantly anti-Semitic. And I gave many examples of that earlier. The anti-Semitism of the right is familiar. It's born of the same impulses as the racism of the right. The Klan engaged in lynchings, not just of black individuals, but of Jewish individuals as well, something also that my students aren't aware of. The anti-Semitism of the left may share characteristics with that. The anti-Semitism of the left isn't new. Right now, the anti-Semitism of the left is very focused on being anti-Zionist. As I said, it often gets expressed as anti-Jewish. Ultimately, anti-Semitism is anti-Semitism, but it does feel right now on many campuses like a two-front war. Um, on many campuses, the left is much more powerful than the right. That's not true always. There are certainly campuses where the right is very powerful. But if you talk about a campus like University of California, Berkeley, the students are much more liberal than they are conservative. You see much more of the anti-Semitism of the left than you do of the right.
There is a person who says, I'm a university student, and I have found anti-Semitic views being taught by professors, um, and is stating this as a question of concern.
Let me respond directly and then more generally. Directly, if you feel that a professor is expressing anti-Semitic views, write to the department chair, write to the dean, write to the provost. And if you're not comfortable identifying yourself, do so anonymously. As was said in the kind introduction, I'm a dean of a law school, and I have received complaints about faculty being anti-Semitic in what they said, or racist, or Islamophobic. I take those very seriously. Please give specifics when you write to your department chair or your dean. Just saying this professor is anti-Semitic doesn't provide enough information, but detail what it was that was said. And I hope that your university, where the department chair, the dean, the provost will take it very seriously. I think that my campus does. I hope yours does as well. Now, to speak of this more generally, in terms of when there's the expression of anti-Semitism or racism or Islamophobia in a class, the academic freedom provides some protection for faculty and what they say when they teach. But academic freedom, like the First Amendment, isn't absolute. Somebody could not go into the classroom and use it as a platform for expressing racist or anti-Semitic or Islamophobic ideas. They can't go in and proselytize, say, an anti-Israel position. The line between the permissible under academic freedom and the impermissible is often going to be a very difficult one to draw. But I'll give a couple of examples. One example occurred at Stanford University, where not long after October 7th, an instructor said that he was going to make all of the Jewish students go to the back of the room so that they could feel what it was like to be isolated. Academic freedom doesn't protect the ability to do that. There was an incident on the Berkeley campus where an instructor told the students they'd get extra credit if they went to the pro-Palestinian rally. This was an engineering class that had nothing to do with the subject matter. Academic freedom doesn't protect the ability to do that. Academic freedom, though, does protect the ability of professors to express views, even controversial ones. And the question then is, where is that line to be drawn?
Elizabeth Messica, who lives in Israel, um, asked if you can comment on this question. She says, "How do you react to people who use the disproportionality argument in Gaza against Israel management of the war against Hamas? Is this anti-Semitism?"
I don't believe that criticizing Israel's policies are anti-Semitic any more than I believe criticizing United States policies are anti-American. I think one can strongly support the existence of Israel as a Jewish state, but criticize the Netanyahu government, just like one can be strongly pro-American and criticize the coming Trump government or the current Biden government. I think one can say that Israel's use of force in Gaza was disproportionate or that Israel's force was justified, but neither of those things are anti-Semitic.
Bill Green asked if you could speak to the fact that you've cited the Supreme Court decisions regarding constitutionality on free speech cases, and you've also made strong critiques of the court. Um, how would you compare the free speech decisions to other subjects? It's a little bit broad at the end, but the yeah.
It's a great question. I think it's hard to generalize about the Supreme Court in free speech. Through much of American history, the Supreme Court had a terrible record with regard to speech. The first Supreme Court cases about speech weren't until the early 20th century. And then the Supreme Court upheld laws that were clearly unconstitutional. In a series of cases in 1919, the Supreme Court upheld people being punished just for criticizing World War I in the military draft. In the McCarthy era, the Supreme Court upheld convictions of people for no more than studying the works of Marx, Lenin, and Engels. In recent years, the Supreme Court has been more protective of freedom of speech. And so, again, when you look at history, it's a mixed record. But I'd be less critical of what the Supreme Court has done with regard to free speech in recent years than I would be critical of what the court has done, say, with regard to abortion or race in recent years.
One person makes a comment saying that they, as a part of a national organization with a chapter in New Mexico in the post-October 7th, um, there was apparently as a part of the meeting, there was a monologue started against down the anti-Semitic path, criticizing Israel. And the political chair um, commented that this is a domestic political organization, does not deal with international affairs, and that stopped the tirade against Jews as a state political platform. So I just mentioned that as a comment that that. And one last question. This comes from the student who asked the earlier question, saying that the student had brought these issues to the departments with specifics, but had found that in this case, the department, the faculty were unwilling to pursue the allegations. And basically, I think the question is, how can departments navigate allegations without inherently creating a political minefield?
No faculty member has the right to create a hostile environment for a student. Faculty members can express views and inevitably will do so, but they can't do so in a manner that crosses the line that I referred to. I obviously know nothing about the circumstance. I can't comment on it. But what I would say to the student or other students, if you believe that a professor has crossed a line into the impermissible, into the proselytizing views that are anti-Israel, go to the department chair. And if the department chair is not sufficiently responsive, go to the dean of the school. Go to the president or the university provost of the school. Um, and maybe there will be no response. Maybe the school will be too timid to act. But I think it's so important to raise it. And my hope is that your school will be responsive. And if the department doesn't do so, go higher than the department.
Okay, we do have one more question that Michael Wall asked, that if the Department of Education were to be eliminated in the upcoming administration, what would be who would be left to protect against anti-Semitism?
It's a great question. If the Department of Education is eliminated, who will do all the things that the Department of Education does under federal law? Does this mean that the federal laws will no longer exist? You might remember that before there was the Department of Education, there was the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare. The Department of Education was removed from it and made the Department of Education, and it became the Department of Health and Human Services. Will education go back into the Department of Health and Human Services? And is that anything but reorganization? I don't foresee the Department of Education actually being eliminated. I think that was just campaign rhetoric. But if it is, you raised the right question. Who's going to enforce these laws?
Dean Chemerinsky, thank you so much for being with us today for this Leonard Torabin Memorial Lecture at the Santa Fe Distinguished Lecture Series. And we look forward to the possibility of further discussions with you. I would be delighted if we could at some point talk about the issues of originalism.
I'd be delighted to. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for being here.